Hello everybody, it's jrobi. Today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of games in the King's Indian attack opening strategy from White. And I've selected two games. One's an older game played by Bobby Fischer, and it was played in 1967, and it's called A Night in Tunisia. And we're going to be taking a look at that. It's a really good game to show some attacking possibilities in the King's Indian attack lines. And the other game that I've selected is a much more recent game. It took place in 2009 in Linares, and it was played between Radjabov and Aronian. And just to give you an idea of the ratings of both of these gentlemen, Aronian was rated 2750 and Radjabov was rated 2761. So, when I said in the last video that the opening has been declining in popularity since the 1900s, that's true, but it still sees use at the top levels of chess. In fact, if you go search it in a number of databases, you'll find a lot of games that took place so far in 2009 with the King's Indian attack lines. But nonetheless, we're going to get started here. So the first game that we're going to take a look at is one between Radjabov and Aronian. And White opens up with f3, knight to f3, and Black plays the standard response pawn up to d5. And from here, play continues. White pushes the pawn up now to g3. So we're getting ready to fianchetto that bishop, giving it access to this very nice light square diagonal. And from here, Black plays bishop now to g4. So attacking the knight here on f3. And a good response, of course, is just to tuck that bishop now onto g2. It's in the fianchetto position. The king's going to be ready to castle at any time, and just standard moves here in the King's Indian attack line. From here, Black decides to play pawn up now to e6, so giving the pawn here on d5 another defender, also opening up access for the dark square bishop to get into the game. From here, Radjabov continued castling. Black plays knight up now to d7, and White pushes the pawn up now to d4. Now, this move is an interesting move. It scores just as strong as the most played move in the position, which is simply pushing the pawn up to d3. But it's definitely playable and interesting. So if you're a King's Indian attack player and you usually play d3, you might want to take a look at pawn to d4 in this position. And it's an interesting move because if you look at it, like pawn to d4, of course, is doing a really important thing. It's preventing the knight from accessing c5 and e5. And you're really not creating any weakness in your position, from White's perspective. So it's definitely playable. So nonetheless, from here, play continues now. Black pushes the pawn up now to c6. So basically giving another defender here to the pawn on d5. So we've got a really nice, strong central support structure here for the pawn on d5. And of course, the dark square bishop can still come out now and develop to, say, e7, or even come out a little bit more aggressively to b4, depending on how play follows. Of course, we got to remember, though, that we do have this pawn on d4, so the knight can access c5 or e5, but the knight still has options, for example, b6 at some point, or later on in the game once this knight is developed, maybe sitting here on f6. So, Black's in a fairly decent workable position as well. But nonetheless, from here, White simply plays knight up now to d2. So as you can see here from the last video, we're very much in the King's Indian attack structure. It's very hard for Black to prevent White from getting into the structure. It's just a matter of how the moves go in what order. But generally speaking, White's going to get into the structure pretty easily. So from here now, Black develops the knight up to f6, and White swings the rook over now to e1. So that rook is giving some nice pressure along the e-file and preparing for this pawn here on e2 to push up. From this position now, Black finally develops that dark square bishop, and White thrusts that pawn forward now to e4. Now, basically, after taking the pawn here on e4, Radjabov decided to capture with the knight, and instead of taking with the knight in this position, Black decided to castle. And Radjabov from here now solidified his pawn on d4, and Black swung its rook over now to the e-file to give this bishop another defender, preparing for this pawn to push forward at some point. From here now, White takes that knight, and Black recaptures with the dark square bishop. And this was a really good move from White, because basically what this bishop is doing is it's chomping on granite right now, and that basically means that this pawn chain here, carving up along this dark square diagonal, is preventing this dark square bishop from doing virtually anything in this position. It can't access e5, of course, because the pawn is protecting it. It can't access g5, and it can't access h4 because of the knight and the pawn here on g3. So this bishop is really hemmed in. It's, technically it's developed. Like usually you'll see a dark square bishop here on f6, but in this position here, it's really not that conductive to strong play from black's perspective, because the only squares that it can really go to currently is back here to e7, or maybe at some point here to d8 if the queen were to move. Alternatively, black could maybe push the pawn forward and tuck the bishop into g7 or h8. But that's not an ideal solution to the problem, because white still has its dark square bishop here on c1, pointing along this nice dark square diagonal, and of course the queen can always play a role later on, capitalizing on some dark square weaknesses. So it was a good move from Radjabov to go down this line. From here now, white simply pushes the pawn up to h3, attacking the bishop here on g4. Black swings the bishop back, and instead of continuing to harass the bishop, because that would weaken the structure of the pawns here, white decides to swing the queen over now to b3. So a nice aggressive, quick move. The queen's attacking the pawn here on b7. In response, black plays queen up now to b6. Now, instead of trading the queens in this position, Radjabov simply swung his knight over now to d2. So he's basically saying, okay, if you want to do a queen trade, I'll do it, but if I'm going to do it, I'm going to get a piece in a better position. And that's something that, I learned early on in chess. A lot of people were emphasizing that if you're going to trade material, really think about, is it going to benefit you, or is it going to maintain the same strength in the position, or is it going to help your opponent develop? So in this case, if we swing back a move, once black brings the queen up here to b6, if white were to capture the queen, black can simply either place his knight on a little bit better of a square, because right now the knight really can't access the squares here on c5 and e5 because of the pawn. So black could simply take with the knight after the queens come off, or alternatively, if black wanted to, it could capture with the pawn and maybe double up rooks here on the a file. So there's a lot of options that black has if white decides to go ahead and trade. But of course, Radjabov was too smart for that and simply played his knight over now to d2. Now, playing the knight over to d2, interesting enough, of course, we're blocking our own dark square bishop in the process, but that's a short-term problem, because not only do we have the benefit of getting a more active piece if black decides to trade, but the knight is also eyeing up now the square here on e4, which could be a very important square moving forward, because it's going to be attacking this bishop that once again isn't doing a whole heck of a lot in the position. And once again, if this knight is sitting on e4, these squares here will be covered, preventing the bishop from accessing g5, and of course the pawn is preventing the bishop from accessing h4. So it's a very nice move in the position. It does have a little drawback, of course, that we're tucking that bishop in, and it can't get out at the moment, but that's, like I said, it's a short-term problem. It can be rectified fairly quickly. From this position here, black pushes the pawn forward now to e5. Now, instead of capturing the pawn, Radjabov decided to push his own pawn up now to d5, but it's an interesting position, so I'm going to flip back a move. If Radjabov would have captured the pawn, black has a nice move, simply recapturing with the knight, and now all of a sudden the knight is going to be able to take advantage of the d3 square. For example, play could continue as follows. White could play the knight up to e4, at which point black can simply swing the bishop off to e7, taking it away from the f6 square that the knight was attacking. And from here, white could attack the bishop, but black can simply ignore that now, swing the knight down to d3, attacking both the bishop and the rook. Once the rook is saved, the knight comes in, takes the bishop, attacking the queen at the same time. So white definitely has to do something about this. Captures the knight, and then black swings the bishop here to g6 to safety. Now, all of the advantage that Radjabov would have been building up in the position would be gone. According to computer analysis, this is a very equal position, but I think black stands a little bit better here because the center is very open and black has the bishop pair. So to avoid this line, of course, Radjabov, when he was facing this position, instead of capturing that pawn, decided to push his own pawn up now to d5. And now black has some decisions to make. Does black capture the pawn on d5, or does black play a different move? In the game, black decided to play queen to c7. But if we flip back a move, this is another interesting position, because if black would have taken the pawn here on d5, all of a sudden now white can come crashing into the position with the queen, attacking the undefended knight on d7. And of course, we also have two attackers now lined up on the pawn on b7. And irregardless of what black plays, black is going to go down a pawn in this position. For example, black could swing the rook over now to d8 to defend the knight, and white doesn't even have to take the pawn here on b7 yet. White can simply swing the knight over now to b3, opening up access for the dark square bishop. From here, if black plays something like rook to b8 to defend this pawn, white has the nice move bishop now to e3, attacking the queen. When the queen goes to safety, white can attack the queen again, and when the queen
peels off here now to c6. White can trade, and there goes the pawn here on a7. So it was definitely a losing position for black if he would have captured here. So instead of doing that, of course, black peels the queen off to c7. And from this position now, white pushes the pawn up now forward to d6. And now white is starting to take advantage of its positional strengths, because black doesn't really have a great option in this position. If black takes the pawn, for example, with the queen, then white's queen just comes crashing into the position, snags up the pawn on b7, and if black attacks the queen, gobbles up the pawn on c6, at which point black would have to swing the queen to safety. So that's definitely not in black's best interest. But unfortunately for black, that would have been better than what was played in the game. Black decided to peel the queen off to safety by placing it on b8. And this lets the knight here on d2, which was blocking in our dark square bishop, swing over now to e4, and it's going to be a monster in the position. It's going to be attacking the dark square bishop here on f6, and the dark square bishop doesn't have anywhere to go except for d8. Also, we have a passed pawn in the position that's now going to be defended by the knight, so it's just not looking too good for black. So what was played, of course, was knight swung the knight over to e4, attacking that dark square bishop and defending the pawn here on d6. Black played its bishop over now to d8. Now this dark square bishop of black's does have access along this dark square diagonal now. So what white does to circumvent that is simply plays its bishop now to e3. So white is completely developed. It's got a passed pawn, and it's got more activity in the center compared to black. So white's definitely in a stronger position here. From this position now, black plays its bishop up now to b6. And instead of trading, white simply pushes its pawn up now to h4. This is going to liberate this light square bishop to give it influence along this light square diagonal now, along with, of course, having influence along that light square diagonal. So Radjabov is just playing very positionally sound chess in this position. And of course, if the dark square bishop of black's captures white's dark square bishop, then our rook activates and gets into a much more active position. We can double the rooks, or we can swing this rook over to contribute to a kingside castle attack. So some definitely good positional trumps here that white has. From this position, black does not capture that bishop and instead pushes his pawn up now to h6. And Radjabov from here swings that bishop now to h3, attacking this undefended knight. Black defends that knight, and then Radjabov unleashes an attack and captures the pawn on h6. And interestingly enough, this doesn't lead to a dynamic checkmate tactic or anything like that, but it does lead to a very strong position if this bishop is taken. For example, if the pawn takes a bishop here on h6, white has a nice move. Bishop takes on d7, and black cannot recapture this bishop, because if black does capture the bishop, look at that fork that happens. It's just brutal. So black definitely can't do that. So once the bishop captures, the best move that black has is to swing the rook to safety, at which point white can now tuck the bishop onto f5 and have a very good game from that position. Now, of course, Radjabov's opponent didn't capture the bishop in that position, saw the dangers associated with that, and instead played knight over now to c5, attacking the queen. From which point now Radjabov replied knight takes here on c5, and instead of capturing the knight right away, what black does is it takes the pawn now on d6, because the queen is attacking both the undefended knight and the undefended bishop. Radjabov decides to keep his knight now and swings the knight to d7 because it's protected by the light square bishop here on h3, at which point black grabs the bishop now on h6. So material so far is equal, but that's about to change right now because Radjabov just comes in and snags up the bishop on b6, and when black recaptures, white is once again up a pawn in the position. So from here, black plays bishop down to f3, and Radjabov swings his queen back down to e3. The white queen goes to h5 to protect the bishop, and Radjabov just wants to clear those bishops off the table. So he plays his bishop to g2. Black takes, king recaptures, and from here now black tries to get his rooks more active into the game and plays rook to a4. Now from this position, Radjabov plays queen to g5. He wants to get these queens off the table. Black obliges, Radjabov recaptures. Now we have this open H file that white could use if it wanted to. But once the black king comes to H7, Radjabov decides to push the pawn up to A3. So now the B pawn is supporting these two pawns in this pawn island. Black plays king now to G6, attacking this pawn. But Radjabov just simply swings his rook over now to D1 because he's not really worried about losing the pawn. For example, if the king takes a pawn here on G5, Radjabov just gets to infiltrate with his rooks, and once that
happens, Radjabov is going to get the pawn back, and he's going to have a much stronger position to work with in the endgame because the rook is protecting the base of this pawn island here by protecting the b2 pawn, and the white king is going to be a lot more active in this position than the black king, because the black king is going to have to worry about these pawns here that this rook is eyeing up. So instead of doing that, of course, after Radjabov played rook over to d1, instead of capturing the pawn, black simply plays his rook down now to e6, and this just lets white continue on with his plan of infiltration with the rook. So the rook now goes to d7, at which point black now pushes the pawn up to b5 to prevent that pawn from being captured, and white now doubles up the rooks. From here, black plays rook over now to c4, and white swings its rook over now to c7, so it's getting ready to double up the rooks on the 7th rank. Black pushes his pawn forward, and take a look at this. This is just a beautiful position that white's built up towards. Now, from here, black tries to push the pawn forward a little bit more, but white can just simply capture, because once black recaptures, the fundamental difference in this position is that the black rooks are not coordinated together just yet, whereas white rooks are just dominant on the 7th rank. They're just going to come ripping into the position, which is exactly what happens. The white rook takes a pawn on f7. Black swings its rook over now to g4, trying to connect its rooks. White hits a check, and from here we have a series of checks, a little bit of repetition in the position, but once the king goes over to h5, white simply brings its rook down now to f3 to prevent these rooks from being connected. Black hits a check. White swings its king over now to h3. Black takes a pawn, and before white recaptures, white hits a check, and when the king pushes back, now white recaptures, and when the king recaptures, white pushes the pawn up now to b3, because the rook is protecting the pawn on c3. So what we have two pawns up in the position. It's looking very grim for black in this position. From here now, black puts the king on to g6, and white simply makes his king come a little bit closer to the center of the board, plays it over to g3. Black attacks the pawn here on a3, but white doesn't really worry about that, because if white were to say push the pawn up to a4, white's just going to drop a couple pawns. So instead of worrying about it, white simply brings his king closer to the center. Black takes that pawn, but now white simply pushes its pawn up to b4, and the rook is defending this pawn here on c3 rather nicely, so white doesn't have to worry about that whatsoever. So from this position, black plays king to f7. White brings his king right into the center of the board. Black puts his king on to e7, and white now gets ready to start launching the attacks and checks on the enemy king. And in this position, black resigns, because there's nothing that black is going to be able to do to stop a substantial material loss and eventually the game. So it was an interesting game from a couple top-ranked players in the world today. So the King's Indian attack definitely healthy out there. But like I said, it's not the most played opening, but it still sees some good healthy use, which is awesome. So if you are thinking about the King's Indian attack, it'll definitely be a workable opening for you. But now I want to get to the Bobby Fischer game. So I hope you got some energy to go through another game here today. Pause the video if you want to, grab a coffee, whatever. But we're going to get into a Night in Tunisia with Bobby Fischer. Now, this game took place in 1967, before Fischer's World Championship Series against Spassky, but he's got a lot of King's Indian attack games in his database, so it's definitely worthwhile to take a look at. I've got his database of games up on my website too, if you want to take a look. But we're just going to dive right into it here. So Fischer opens up with pawn to e4. Black replies with the French defense pawn to e6, and Fischer plays now pawn to d3. From here, black swings a pawn up now to d5, attacking the pawn here on e4. Fischer just develops a knight now to d2, so giving that pawn a defender, another defender than the pawn here on d3. Black continues now knight to f6, and Fischer gets ready to fianchetto his bishop by pushing his pawn forward on g3. So as you can see here, we're getting into that staple King's Indian attack position. From here, black pushes a pawn up now to c5. Basically trying to secure more space on the queen side, which is what I talked about in my last video on the King's Indian attack, that black will generally get a little bit more room on the queen side, but in return, white will get a little bit more attacking opportunities on the kingside castle position of black. So from here now, Fischer plays, of course, fianchetto, gets a bishop to g2. Black plays knight up now to c6, and Fischer plays his knight up now to f3. So very, very close to the staple position. We're just a castle away. So from here now, black plays his bishop to e7, Fischer castles, and then black castles, and Fischer pushes the pawn up now here to e5. And basically what we're doing here is Fischer is giving up control a little bit here of f5, and of course the pawn's ability to attack here on d5, but the pawn is also now kind of an annoying little menace here. pointing towards these two squares, and it's something that black is going to have to deal with. And the first move, of course, the most played move in the position that black would play here is simply to swing the knight over now to d7. Now we do have a couple of attackers lined up here on this pawn, so in reply, Fischer swings the rook over now to e1, giving this pawn a second defender, but also making way for this knight to come over here to f1. And that's going to be very important because that's going to liberate the bishop that's sitting over here on c1. We could fianchetto the bishop. There's the option to do so, but bringing the knight over here to f1 in this particular position just opens up this nice long dark square diagonal pointing towards black's king. And of course, the king is, the end game in chess. So from this position, black plays a pawn up now to b5, so coming down again more with that queenside space advantage. And now Fischer swings his knight over to f1. So this bishop is now liberated, and it should be said also that there still is the option to fianchetto this bishop at a later time if necessary. So Fischer's definitely keeping his options open. From here now, black pushes the pawn forward to b4. Fischer replies pawn to h4, and this move, of course, is accomplishing a couple things, and we'll just take a moment to look at the position. First of all, pawn to h4, of course, is staking a little bit more claim to the g5 square. But more importantly, if we take a look at white's knights in the position, we have the knight here on f1. Now the knight on f1, if needed, can swing to h2 if it wants to. It can also come up later on to e3 if necessary. And of course, these are all staging squares. If we take a look at, for example, h2, the knight can now access g4. If the knight ever were to land on e3, the knight, of course, could come up as well, along with g4, can also access f5 at some point. And then we have to look at the other knight here sitting on f3 already. Of course, this knight already is contributing to the defense here of this g5 square, basically giving it into white solid territory. But the knight also could swing back if necessary here to h2 and then up to g4. So there's a lot going on here that white has at its disposal. So h4 was a good move in the position from Fischer. From here now, black pushes the pawn up to a5, so continuing on with that queenside pawn storm, from which Fischer replies bishop now to f4. Giving the pawn here on e5 another defender just in case black wants to bring another piece into the attack to put pressure on that square. But of course now we can bring up the queen now to support this bishop along this nice dark square diagonal. So definitely a good move in the position. From here, black continues pushing the pawns on the queen side. Fischer now places a pawn to a3 and a couple pawns come off the table. We have an open b file which black is going to probably try to use considering its queenside initiative so far. And from here, black does bring another piece into the action. So now a minor piece along with some pawns have been diverted. And we can't forget that black's bishops, of course, are bearing down on these diagonals that could be used later on in the game. So black is definitely interested in queenside activity. From here now, Fischer brings up the knight now to e3. We talked a little bit before about this knight and how it can now access the squares f5 at some point if it becomes available, and of course g4 to contribute to some kind of attack on the kingside castle position. And from here now, black brings another minor piece into the queenside by playing bishop to a6, giving it access to this light square diagonal pointing towards f1. From here now, Fischer plays bishop to h3. And if we take a moment just to look at bishop to h3, first of all, Fischer's telling his opponent a couple things. Number one, he's not interested in any kind of queenside activity himself. We see all of Fischer's minor pieces are built up here on the kingside castle position of white. Now if we take a look at this knight here on e3, if necessary, this knight can now come to g2 at some point and gain access to these squares here to hop up here and contribute to a kingside castle attack. But generally, Fischer's saying there is no way I'm interested in any kind of queenside play. I am going for an attack on the castled king. So from here now, black pushes his pawn up now to d4. And I want to take a moment and talk a little bit about this. If you've looked through a lot of Fischer's games, you'll notice that one thing that he does is he likes to maintain tension as long as possible. So the last few moves by Fischer, he's just kind of getting his pieces into positions that he wants to have them to use for an attack. He's not really creating any weaknesses by doing so, and it's black that really is forcing the issue on the queen side. Now that black has pushed the pawn up to d4, there's been some tension released in the board. In particularly the squares e4 and c4, and those are going to be great outposts for a knight in the future for Fischer to capitalize on. Because if you have a knight here, for example, on e4, well, all of a sudden, of course, that knight is now pointing to a lot of useful squares that can be very beneficial in a kingside castle attack. So Fischer is definitely going to make use of that. So from here now, Fischer swings his knight down now to f1,
Black swings another minor piece into the queenside by playing knight up to b6, and Fischer now places his knight onto g5. So we have the beginnings of Fischer starting to take advantage of these weaknesses that Black has created. From here now, Black plays knight up to d5. Fischer swings his bishop down now to d2, keeping an eye, of course, on these squares c3 and e3. From here, Black takes that pesky knight because he doesn't want to have this knight sitting here on e4. Fischer recaptures, and Black places his queen now onto d7, getting it away from this bishop scope. From here now, Fischer plays queen up to h5, and I don't know what Fischer's opponent was thinking, but I'm pretty sure that Bobby Fischer was thinking, hello, I'm Bobby Fischer, I'm coming to checkmate you. And the position is just so favorable for White. All we need to do is take a look at Black's pieces, and Black is trying to get his pieces on the queen side to come up with some kind of queen side play, but there's really nothing here for Black. This knight can't access b3. This pawn is preventing that. This bishop is really just chomping on nothing. It can sit here on b5 if it wants to, but it's not going to accomplish anything great. This knight can come down to c3, but what's it threatening really? It's not really attacking any pieces. It can't be rerouted anywhere useful because the rook is covering e2 here, and it can come to b2, but once again, what's the point? Alternatively, if we take a look at Fischer's position, we have a bishop here beautifully placed on g5. We have the light square bishop that can jump into the action at some point depending on how play follows. We have this monstrous rook that can just leap up and start attacking along with the queen. White is just in a great position here, and Fischer, by playing queen to h5, is basically saying, I'm coming for you. What are you going to do about it? So from here now, Black tries to continue with the queenside activity, swings the rook over to c8. Really, once again, not really accomplishing a great deal. From here, Fischer brings his knight up now to d2, and Black replies knight over to c3. Now, the knight, technically this knight has a good outpost. Like ideally you want to have your knight on your opponent's third rank because it has a lot of great jump points, but once again we're in a position where this knight really isn't accomplishing a great deal. So Fischer continues now and plays bishop up to f6 and basically says, okay, it's game on, let's do this. Now if Black takes the bishop, it's just going to lose material. So pawn captures here, and through a series of moves, Fischer is going to force Black to give up a rook here and be an amazing amount of material ahead. So that's definitely not a good move. So what Black decides to do is play queen over to e8, from which Fischer now brings his knight up to this beautiful square e4. Now we had talked about that earlier once his pawn pushed. So now Fischer is getting his other knight to capitalize on this. And of course from here, this knight can access g5. So from here now his opponent plays pawn up now to g6, attacking the queen. Fischer swings the queen over now to g5, and let's just take a look at this position. We have amazing dark square control. All that Fischer needs to do at some point is nestle his queen onto h6, and he's threatening mate. And all these dark squares, there's nothing that Black can do to prevent White from capitalizing on these. So what Fischer's opponent plays in this position is he takes that pesky knight away, but hello, beautifully developed rook. Boom, e4. Now this rook can swing over here and contribute to the attack as well. From here, Fischer's opponent desperately tries to push forward on the queen side, but it's really hopeless at this point. Fischer just pushes the pawn up now to h5, giving this nice h4 square the access for his rook. From here now, Black takes a pawn. Fischer just swings his rook over, completely ignores it. Black pushes his rook now to a7. Fischer swings his bishop down. Black takes, one square away from promotion. Fischer doesn't worry about that, just threatens checkmate in one. From here, the queen comes over in an attempt to protect the checkmate, but if you can see the mate sequence, pause the video if you want to. It's a beautiful line, but from here, all Fischer does is he simply captures the pawn on h7, and Black resigns. And the reason Black resigns is because if the king captures, pawn takes with check. Once the king takes that pawn, watch this light square bishop just jump into action and deliver on the checkmate. So it's just a beautiful game that Fischer played, and it was a really good example of how he handled the queenside activity in the King's Indian attack. And instead of worrying about it and playing to his opponent's moves, Fischer just slowly worked towards his plan, and his opponent created weaknesses along the way. So I found that the game and especially the end sequence was just beautiful. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this time that we spent on the King's Indian attack. I know it's a little bit longer than my other videos, but I definitely wanted to spend a little bit of time on it because I said in the video that I did on it before that it's been declining in popularity over the last few decades, but it's not because it's not a strong opening. It still sees fairly healthy use at the top levels of play, and hopefully there'll be a resurgence on the opening and it'll start to pick up some more steam, because it's definitely not one of those openings that black can have an easy time playing against. So take care. I hope you enjoyed the video. Looking forward to your feedback, and we'll see you next time.